The night I walked into the anchor room. As told by Johnson. People ask me sometimes how I met my wife, and I've learned over the years to warn them first. It's not a short story, and it doesn't start out looking like a love story at all. It starts with me getting rejected by a woman I barely knew, driving nowhere in particular with my jaw clenched, and ending up on a bar stool with absolutely no plan except to stop feeling anything for a few hours. So if you've got the time, pull up a chair. I'll tell it properly. Where it starts. I was 48 years old that October, divorced 11 years, and if you'd asked me at the time whether I was happy, I would have said yes without much hesitation. That's the strange thing about loneliness. It doesn't always feel like loneliness while you're living inside it. It just feels like Tuesday, then Wednesday, then a decade of Wednesdays. There was a woman at my office named Denise. We worked in the same building, different floors, and for about 3 weeks we'd been having lunch together a few times a week. I liked her. I liked the way she laughed at my terrible spreadsheet jokes, which, trust me, take real effort to make funny. So I finally worked up the nerve to ask her to dinner. A real one. Candles, wine, the whole uncomfortable ceremony of it. She let me down easy. That's the phrase people use, isn't it? Let down easy. As if there's a way to hear "I don't think of you that way" that doesn't feel exactly like what it is. I stood outside that coffee shop feeling like I was 19 again, except worse, because at 19 you've got your whole life ahead of you to absorb a blow like that. At 48, you start doing math you don't want to do. I got in my car with no destination in mind. I just drove, and I ended up parked outside a bar called the Anchor Room, a place I must have passed 100 times in that neighborhood without ever once walking in. That night I walked in, I sat down. I told myself one very simple thing: I'm going to drink until I stop feeling like this. It wasn't a good plan. It was barely a plan at all. But it's what led me to the best decision I never actually made on purpose. The woman at the end of the bar. The place was dim, that warm amber kind of dim that makes everybody look a little softer than they really are. There was a ball game playing on a TV nobody was watching too closely, a jukebox humming something bluesy in the corner, a few couples tucked into booths, and down at the far end of the bar, alone, there was a woman with auburn hair pulled back loose, turning a glass of red wine slowly between her fingers without actually drinking much of it. I sat 3 stools down and ordered a whiskey. Then another. I'm not much of a drinker, if I'm honest. A beer with dinner, wine at my sister's Thanksgiving table. But that night I wanted the edges of the evening blurred, and by the 3rd whiskey they were starting to blur nicely. The bartender, a big fellow named Pete, gray beard, the kind of guy who's clearly seen every version of a sad man at his bar there is to see, asked me if I was having a rough day. Rough life, I said, and immediately felt ridiculous for how dramatic it sounded out loud. That's when I heard her laugh. Not a cruel laugh, genuinely amused. That's quite a statement for a Friday night, she said. I looked over at her properly for the first time. She had one of those faces that looks built for laughing, little lines at the corners of her eyes that told you she did it often, though that night there was something tired sitting underneath it, same as me, I suppose. Sorry, I said. Didn't mean to broadcast my misery to the whole bar. You didn't broadcast it. I was eavesdropping. Occupational hazard of sitting alone at a bar, you start listening to other people's conversations because you don't have one of your own. And then, without waiting to be invited, she picked up her wine and moved down to the stool right beside mine. I'm Mary Johnson. Just Johnson? No first name? Everybody's called me Johnson since college. It stuck. My mother actually named me Peter Johnson. Sounds like an actor from an old western, doesn't it? She laughed again, and I swear, something in my chest that had been clenched shut all evening loosened a little bit, right then. I don't know how else to explain it except to say that for the first time all night, I forgot to feel sorry for myself. What I told her, and what she told me. I don't usually unload my troubles onto a stranger. That's not really who I am. But something about the light, the whiskey, and the simple fact that I figured I'd never see this woman again after that night loosened my tongue considerably. I told her about Denise. About the 3 weeks of lunches and the "I don't think of you that way" outside the coffee shop and the aimless drive that had landed me on this particular stool. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. When I finished, she didn't offer me any easy comfort, know her loss or you'll find someone. She just said, that's a hard thing. Getting turned down stings no matter how old you get. People think it gets easier with age. It doesn't. You just get better at hiding it. You sound like you're speaking from experience, I said. I am. She finally took a real sip of her wine. Married at 25. Thought it was the great love of my life. 2 years later, I was signing divorce papers at my own kitchen table while he was already halfway out the door with a box under each arm. 24 years ago now, and I could still draw you a picture of that kitchen table from memory. I asked her what happened. She told me the short version, he wasn't who she'd thought he was, and said the long version was a story for a different bottle of wine. Then she said something I've never forgotten, something I still think about now. I was young. I thought love was supposed to feel like drowning, all-consuming, no room to breathe. Took me a long time to figure out that the good kind of love is supposed to feel like breathing easier, not harder. I sat with that for a second, and then we just kept talking. 2 hours went by like nothing. She told me about the bookstore she ran downtown, one of the last independent ones left in the city, something she'd built entirely on her own after the divorce, when she needed something in her life that belonged completely to her. She told me about her hiking trips, her 2 cats, her habit of reading 3 books at once and finishing none of them in order. I told her about my kids, about the accounting job I was fine at but never loved, about the strange emptiness that had crept into my life over the years without my really noticing it happening. By the time Pete called last call, I realized I didn't want the night to be over. I asked for her number clumsily, like I was 19 years old all over again, and she wrote it on a bar napkin in loopy, confident handwriting. Call me, she said, preferably sober. Let's see if this conversation holds up in daylight. Daylight. It held up. I called 2 days later, not the next date. I didn't want to seem desperate, but not so late she'd think I didn't care either, and we met for coffee that Sunday. Sober. In the flat gray light of a Sunday afternoon, Mary was a little different than the bar version of her, more careful with her words, a bit more guarded. The bar version had been charming. This version was sharp, thoughtful, unhurried, in a way I found deeply calming after so many years of my own restless routine. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into more dinners. I started stopping by her bookstore on my lunch breaks, not because I read all that much, but because I liked watching her work, the easy authority she had recommending books to strangers, the little handwritten cards she tucked onto shelves with her own thoughts scribbled on them. She'd built something real out of nothing, and there was something in that I admired more than I knew how to say out loud. By December, we were spending most weekends together. By February, I had a drawer at her apartment, she had a key to my house, and it was honestly the easiest relationship I'd ever been in. I should have known that easy doesn't stay easy forever. Nothing worth having does. The first real trouble. The trouble came in April, 7 months after that night at the Anchor Room, and it came from a direction I didn't see coming at all. My daughter, Ashley, 26, living in Chicago, came to visit for a long weekend. I'd mentioned Mary before, carefully, not wanting to make too much of it too soon, but this was the first time Ashley would actually meet her. I'd hoped for an easy Sunday brunch. What I got instead was tension so thick you could have cut it with the untouched butter knife sitting on the table. Ashley had never fully forgiven me for the divorce, even though it was her mother who'd wanted out, even though I'd done everything I could over the years to stay a steady presence in her life. That wound predated Mary by a long stretch. But Mary, through absolutely no fault of her own, became the place where years of unresolved hurt finally found somewhere to land. It's just weird, Ashley said, once Mary had stepped away to the restroom, her voice low and tight. You dating someone. It's weird, Dad. I know it's an adjustment. It's not an adjustment. It's weird. You're 48. Doesn't it feel a little pathetic, falling head over heels like some teenager? That word, pathetic, landed like a slap. I felt my face go hot, and for a second I wanted to snap right back at her. Instead, I took a breath and said quietly, I loved your mother, and that ended. and I spent 11 years alone telling myself I was fine with it. I'm not going to apologize for finally not being alone anymore. She didn't have a response to that. The rest of the visit stayed cold under a thin layer of politeness, and by the time she left for the airport, I felt wrung out in a way I hadn't expected. That night, Mary found me sitting on my back porch in the cold, a beer sweating on the railing that I hadn't touched. "I should just go," she said gently, sitting beside me. "Not go. I mean, maybe we should slow this down. I don't want to be the reason there's this rift between you and your daughter." I turned to look at her, and something old in me, some habit of smoothing things over, of making myself smaller so nobody else had to deal with the mess of my actual feelings, wanted to agree with her, wanted to let things shrink back down to something safer. But I thought about 11 empty years, about how much lighter my chest had felt every single day since she'd slid 3 stools down that bar and sat beside me. "No," I said. "I'm not doing that again. I spent over a decade making myself small so nobody would have to deal with me actually feeling something. I'm not going to do that to you, and I'm not going to let my daughter's discomfort talk me out of the first thing that's made me happy in longer than I want to admit." It was the most certain I'd felt about anything in years, and saying it out loud made it more true, somehow. Mary studied me for a long moment, then reached over and took my hand. "Okay," she said. "Then we don't run from it. We figure it out. Both of us. Building something real. And we did figure it out, slowly, unglamorously, the way real things actually get figured out. Not one grand gesture, but 100 small ones. I called Ashley every week, sometimes to talk about Mary and sometimes deliberately not to, just to remind her the relationship between her and me didn't have to be a casualty of my happiness. Mary, for her part, never tried to force her way into Ashley's good graces. She sent her a birthday card that June, with no mention of me at all, just a warm note and a gift card to a bookstore in Chicago. Small things, patient things. By August, the ice had started to thaw. Not into warmth exactly, but into something workable. That year had its own separate hardships, too. Mary's bookstore went through a rough financial stretch when a chain store opened up 2 blocks away, and for months, she was consumed with worry about whether she'd have to close the business she'd spent over 2 decades building from nothing. I sat with her at her kitchen table plenty of nights going over numbers. Not because I had some magic fix, but because I wasn't going to let her face it alone. We reworked her budget, started up some author events and book clubs to build loyalty, and I dragged a few coworkers in to become regulars. The store survived, barely, but it survived. And I don't think she ever forgot I was there for every hard night of it. I had my own scare that fall, a suspicious result on a routine blood test that sent me into 2 anxious weeks of follow-up testing before the doctors finally told me it was nothing. Those 2 weeks changed something in me. Sitting there genuinely afraid, for the first time in years about my own mortality, I understood with total clarity exactly who I wanted beside me, not just through the easy parts of a life, but through all of it. I didn't propose right away. I wanted to be sure, and more than that, I wanted her to be sure, to never feel rushed the way she had at 25, before she'd had the chance to really see things clearly. But I knew how I asked her. It happened in her bookstore after closing, while she was doing inventory and grumbling about a shipment that had come in with half the boxes damaged. About as unglamorous a setting as you could imagine for a proposal. And I wouldn't change a single thing about it. I'd shown up unannounced, supposedly to help carry boxes, though truthfully I'd had a small ring box sitting in my jacket pocket for 3 days, waiting for what I kept telling myself would be the right moment, slowly realizing there's no such thing, only the moment you finally stop waiting. "You've been weird all week," she said, setting down a stack of paperbacks, eyeing me with suspicion. "What's going on?" "Nothing's going on. Just wanted to see you. Johnson." She put her hands on her hips, the exact posture, I realized, that she used on customers trying to return a water-damaged book and claim it arrived that way. "You're a terrible liar. What is it?" I laughed, and every careful little speech I'd rehearsed for 3 days went right out the window. I just reached into my jacket, pulled out the box, and got down on one knee right there between a shelf of mystery novels and a cardboard box of damaged paperbacks. I had this whole plan, I told her. Dinner reservations, the works. But I've been carrying this thing around for 3 days, trying to find the perfect moment, and I finally realized every moment with you has been the perfect moment, ever since the night you sat down next to me at that bar. So I'm just going to ask, Mary, will you marry me? She stood absolutely still for a second, one hand pressed over her mouth, eyes bright. I found out later she'd been imagining, for weeks, how she'd feel if I ever asked, bracing herself, I think, for the same kind of fear she'd carried since her first marriage fell apart. Instead, standing in a bookstore that smelled like old paper and cardboard dust, she said the words felt like the easiest, truest thing she'd ever said in her life. Yes, she said. Yes, of course, yes. The wedding. We got married that September, small ceremony, her backyard, string lights strung between the trees, about 40 folding chairs for family and friends. Ashley stood beside me, and though some small unhealed part of her was probably still there, she'd genuinely come to like Mary over that year and a half. She'd seen, I think, that I was simply happier than she'd ever known me to be, and happiness in someone you love has a way of dissolving even old resentments, if you let it. Mary's older sister gave a toast that had half the guests in tears, talking about how many years she'd watched Mary throw herself entirely into that bookstore and her independence, convinced she didn't need anybody, and how relieved she'd been the day Mary called her. Giddy as a teenager, describing some man she'd met at a bar. Pete was there too, the bartender from the Anchor Room, invited half as an inside joke that turned out genuinely sentimental. The man who'd poured the whiskey and the wine that started the whole thing, standing there in a rented sport coat, raising a glass to us. Watching Mary walk toward me in that simple ivory dress, hair loose around her shoulders just like it had been that very first night, I had the strangest feeling, like every hard year of my life, the divorce, the loneliness, the humiliating regret outside a coffee shop that sent me driving nowhere in particular, had simply been the long road that led me to that exact backyard, that exact woman, that I was living through it. All of it made perfect sense right then. All of it made perfect sense right then. I, Peter Johnson, I said, my voice thick, take you, Mary, to be my wife. Not because I need someone to fill up an empty house, though God knows I remember what that felt like, but because you make even a full life feel fuller, because you taught me the good kind of love is supposed to feel like breathing easier. I intend to keep breathing easier with you for the rest of my life. She said something back just as unsteady, and when we kissed, that little backyard crowd of 40 erupted loud enough that her 2 cats, watching nervously through the kitchen window, bolted straight for the closet. The cruise. We'd agreed to keep the wedding itself modest. Neither of us, at our age, felt any need for extravagance, but to spend a little more than we probably should have on a proper honeymoon. Mary had always wanted to see the Caribbean. I'd never once in my life been on a cruise. So 2 weeks after the wedding, we flew down to Fort Lauderdale and boarded a ship for a 10-day trip through the islands. I'd figured a cruise would feel something like a floating hotel, pleasant enough, a bit impersonal. I hadn't counted on how much I'd love it, the ocean stretching flat and endless in every direction. Mary standing on our little balcony every morning with her coffee, hair whipping loose in the wind, more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. We snorkeled off Cozumel, where Mary, who never learned to swim particularly well, held onto my arm the entire time, and swore afterward she'd seen a sea turtle, though I'm fairly sure it was a large rock. We wandered the bright streets of Georgetown in the Caymans, buying each other souvenirs neither of us needed. We sat on a beach in Jamaica with rum drinks we never finished, content just to sit there together in comfortable silence. Something I'd learned over those 2 years was its own quiet kind of closeness. Not every moment needs filling up with talk. On the 6th night, the ship put on a formal dinner, and Mary wore a deep blue dress that made me feel, at 49 years old, something absurdly close to the nervous flutter of a teenager on a first date. We danced afterward out on the open deck, under a sky so clear and full of stars it hardly looked real, the dark ocean stretching out all around us, the ship's lights rippling gently across the water. "Can I tell you something?" Mary said, her head against my shoulder as we swayed to music neither of us was really paying attention to. "Anything." When my first marriage ended, I promised myself I'd build a life that didn't need anybody else to be happy. And I did. I built the store. I built a whole life, and it was a good life. But some nights, alone in that apartment, I used to wonder if I'd made a mistake, not in leaving him, that was never a mistake, but in the way I built walls around myself afterward. Whether I'd made myself so safe I'd also made myself alone. And now? I asked. Now I think I just hadn't found the right person to open the walls back up for. I spent 24 years telling myself I was fine on my own, and I was. But this is better. This is so much better, Johnson. I pulled her a little closer, chin resting on top of her head, looking out at that dark water running out toward a horizon I couldn't see. I thought about the man I'd been 18 months earlier, sitting alone in my kitchen after Denise turned me down. Driving with no plan except to stop feeling anything at all. I thought about how close I'd come, in some small way, to just accepting that loneliness as the permanent shape of my life, the price I'd figured, of getting older, of having already had my one shot at love and lost it. I used to think the exact same thing, I told her, that I'd had my chance and missed it. And the rest of my life was just going to be about getting through the days. I'm glad I was wrong. Me too, she said, although for the record, I still think you should send Denise a thank you card. I laughed loud enough that a couple dancing nearby glanced over, and Mary laughed right along with me. And that's really the whole story. Two people who each thought they understood the shape of their own lives, before finding out, quite by accident, on an unremarkable Friday night in a dimly lit bar, that the story wasn't finished after all. How it ends, for now. We came home 10 days later, tanned and rested, and thoroughly unwilling to get back to our regular routines, though, of course, we did. Me back to my spreadsheets, Mary back to her bookstore, with a little photograph from the cruise tucked into the frame of her counter mirror, the two of us laughing on that starlit deck, salt air in our hair. These days, when younger friends or Mary's nieces ask how we met, expecting some elaborate romance, Mary usually just smiles and says, "He got his heart broken on a Friday, walked into my bar, and ordered 3 whiskeys, feeling sorry for himself. I felt bad for him, so I said hello. And me, I always add the same thing. Best rejection of my life." It's not the story I would have chosen, if I'd had any choosing in the matter all those lonely years before it, the divorce that came decades earlier, the small daily disappointments that wore away at both of us long before we ever sat down at that bar together. But looking back now, from wherever I'm standing when I tell it to you, I wouldn't trade a single hard year of it away. Every one of them was just a thread in the larger pattern. The one that led me, eventually, to her. The end.